Hier spricht eine Stimme aus Amerika.
Aus Amerika im Krieg.
Unsere Stimmen kommen zu Ihnen aus New York.
This is a voice speaking from America.
A voice from America at war.
Our voices are coming to you from New York, across the Atlantic Ocean to London, from where they are relayed to you in Germany.
Today, America has been at war for 79 days.
Daily at this time we shall speak to you about America and the war. The news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth.
When the broadcast ended, there wasn't any applause. A light went off, a chair scraped back, and someone removed a pair of headphones and set them down carefully, the way people do when they know something important has just happened but don't yet know what comes next. The words themselves weren't dramatic. They didn't promise victory. They didn't threaten anyone. What they did was make a simpler claim: that the voice speaking would tell the truth, even when the truth wasn't useful. That wasn't a rhetorical choice, it was an operational one. Because once you promise credibility, you have to build systems that can sustain it. You have to decide what gets aired, what gets cut, how fast corrections happen, and who is trusted to speak. You also have to accept that telling the truth sometimes weakens your position in the short term. But the people behind that microphone understood something much larger. Information, like any other infrastructure, only works if people believe it will keep working tomorrow. Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain stories that changed business forever. Every date of the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, February 24th, that story takes us to 1942, when credibility became infrastructure and touched the war. By early 1942, the United States was fighting a war that was not only military but informational. Factories could be built and ships could be launched and supply chains could be expanded, but none of that mattered if people on the other side of the conflict didn't believe what they were hearing. That is where Voice of America came in. That was the clip that you heard. Voice of America was a government-funded international radio service created to broadcast news and information from the United States to audiences overseas, especially into countries controlled by Axis powers. Its job was not to entertain domestic listeners or rally crowds at home. It was designed to speak directly to foreign populations in their own languages over shortwave radio. Radio already had a pretty good reach, but what it didn't have yet was credibility on a large scale. Governments had used broadcasts before, but mostly as propaganda, designed to persuade or exaggerate or intimidate. Those approaches worked briefly, and then they always collapsed because listeners learned to discount them. And once that trust was lost, the signal still traveled, but the message stopped landing. That problem was obvious to the people designing Voice of America. They weren't just trying to get information into Europe. They were trying to build a voice that would still be listened to months later, even when the news turned unfavorable. That meant treating information less like a weapon and more like that word I use so often on this podcast, infrastructure. Something that had to function consistently over time. The decision to promise the truth, even when it wasn't convenient, shaped everything that followed. When Voice of America began broadcasting on February 24th, 1942, it didn't do so from a grand studio or a symbolic monument. The first broadcast came out of New York City, assembled quickly in a borrowed space using existing radio equipment that had been repurposed almost overnight. One of the early figures shaping those broadcasts was William Harlan Hale. He was a journalist brought in not only for his loyalty to a message, but for his instincts about credibility. Other figures came from newspapers, wire services, and academic circles. People who were used to verifying information before releasing it, even under pressure. In that background, it mattered. These were not entertainers, and they were not military officers. They were editors, translators, and announcers, people who understood that listeners in London and Paris and Berlin already knew when something sounded false. So the broadcasts were built carefully. Scripts were reviewed and sources were double-checked. When American ships were lost, it was acknowledged. When battles went badly, it was said plainly. The thinking was simple. If the broadcast matched reality often enough, listeners would keep coming back. And that approach immediately created tension. Officials in Washington wanted reassurance delivered faster. Military leaders wanted messaging aligned more tightly with strategy. But the people running Voice of America held the line because they understood something fragile was being built. Trust doesn't survive shortcuts. Once the organization committed to that standard, it couldn't selectively abandon it. Credibility became the product, and everything else had to adjust around it. Voice of America didn't become famous for a single broadcast. It became influential because over time, people learned where to find it on the dial and what to expect when they did. That mattered in places far beyond the war itself. As the decades passed, Voice of America studios expanded and languages multiplied. Shortwave signals started reaching into Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Listeners often tuned in quietly, sometimes illegally, not because the broadcasts were exciting, but because they were consistent and truthful. And that model held. Media organizations learned that reach without trust eventually decays. Governments learned that control without credibility backfires. Businesses learned that audiences reward institutions that behave predictably, even when the message isn't flattering. The choice made in New York in 1942 by a relatively small group of editors and broadcasters on behalf of an entire country and its government ended up shaping how large organizations would think about communication on much bigger scales for decades to come. See, the United States didn't just launch a radio service. It operationalized credibility, turning truth-telling into a system that could survive pressure, politics, and time. And that decision still echoes through every market where the trust determines who gets heard, and it began on February 24th, 1942, with the launch of the Voice of America. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you're wanting to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.